So welcome to Coffee and Conflict, a National Security Institute podcast, where I'll be sitting down with leading authors and experts every fortnight to discuss some of their most recent works and bigger picture of national security, foreign policy, and intelligence issues. I'm your host, Joshua Huminski, Senior Fellow at the National Security Institute here, Senior Vice President at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. This season, we'll be covering topics ranging from the war in Ukraine, 21st century defense strategy, and the intensifying strategic competition between the United States and China, and more. Join me as I speak with authors and experts to gain their unique insights and perspectives on these crucial topics that impact us all. It's sure to be an engaging and thought-provoking series of conversations that you won't want to miss. So grab your first or second coffee of the day, and let's crack on with our discussion. Today, I'm joined by cybersecurity visionary, business executive, thought leader on geopolitics, and most recently a new author, Dmitri Alperovitch. Dmitri is the co-founder and executive chairman of Silverado Policy Accelerator, a nonprofit focused on advancing American prosperity and global leadership in the 21st century and beyond. There, he's a frequent host and discussant on the, if I may say so, excellent Geopolitics Decanted podcast. I'm not sure really the protocol of endorsing another podcast, but I really like it, and you should probably have it on your queue. Before founding Silverado, he was a co-founder and former CTO of CrowdStrike Inc., a leading cybersecurity company. And most recently, he's the author of The World on the Brink, How America Can Beat China in the Race for the 21st Century, which he joins me today to discuss. So Dmitri, thank you very much for sitting down with me today.
Thanks so much for having me. Congratulations on this incredible podcast. Congrats on the amazing logo. Love it.
I quite like it as well. It really came out very nicely, but thank you so much. I want to dive right into it. Your book opens with a fictional invasion of Taiwan. How likely do you think that is, and when do you think it's going to take place?
So this is why I wrote the book, that I'm convinced that the threat of war is not just very real, but is incredibly acute. And we are on the precipice of a terrible situation. We are a world on the brink. And I believe that Xi Jinping is determined to take Taiwan, peacefully or otherwise, in his lifetime. The man has just turned 71. So do the math and think about the actuarial tables and potentially his length of hold on power. And this is why I'm convinced that 2028 through 2032, maybe slightly beyond that, is going to be a very dangerous period. I don't think that war is imminent. Chinese military is simply not ready to undertake what would be the most complicated military operation in the history of humanity, by far. But they're getting there, and the pace is accelerating. And the other thing that I think is in the back of their minds is that the window is open right now, or going to be shortly, to do this, in part because the United States, over the last 20 years, has dropped its eye off the ball, right? We were fighting wars in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and elsewhere, and really deprioritized the Pacific. The Taiwanese massively dropped the ball in terms of reduced spending on their defense, the atrophying of their military, the Japanese similarly, and that is now changing, right? We woke up to this threat arguably in the last 6 to 8 years. The Taiwanese have, the Japanese have, so there's a lot of investment that's happening on the part of all of the allies here. It's going to take time for those investments to come to fruition, but by the mid-2030s and late 2030s, things are going to get much better for us and for the Taiwanese in terms of all those capabilities coming online, things like AUKUS, investment in new submarines with the Australians and the Brits that are going to double our submarine capacity in the Pacific by the mid-2030s, as just one example. So if China's going to do this, this is really the window to get it done and have the best chance of success. And the longer you wait into the 2030s, the worse it gets.
I want to pick up on that. Just the question is, does Taiwan really matter to Americans' defense posture in the Indo-Pacific? I mean, we're in the middle of an election year right now. We're all talking about interests from Europe to the Indo-Pacific. I mean, for the average American, why does Taiwan matter? I mean, how central is it to America's interest in the Indo-Pacific and American security there?
Well, this is the second reason why I wanted to write this book, because the conversation about Taiwan, to the extent that it even happens in this country, I think is very simplistic, right? Even in the course of the election, you've heard statements made by various candidates saying, well, Taiwan only matters to us because of chips, right? And chips are, of course, vital. Taiwan produces not just 90% of all advanced chips, as is often cited, but even more crucially, 40% of all chips. So you take that off from the supply chains, and you have a disaster on your hand, and probably something that's going to be akin to global depression, the likes of which we haven't seen since the 1930s. But I argue in the book that Taiwan matters to us a lot more than just chips in the economy. And the reason why it matters so much is the geography, right? There is one image in the book, which is a map of the region, but it's a different map from the one that people are usually used to seeing, which is, the big landmass of China, one of the largest countries on the planet, and this tiny speck of land next to it, which is Taiwan. And, when people look at that map, they say, rightfully, why does it matter to us? We're so far away. China's so close. But if you rotate the map and you particularly show the depth of the waters around Chinese shores, and we have sort of China at the top, looking out at the breadth of the Pacific Ocean, the world's biggest ocean, and you see why Taiwan is so critical for China. Taiwan is essentially the cork that keeps China bottled up. China has very unenviable geography. The waters near its shore, both in the South China Sea and in the East China Sea, are very, very shallow. And today, for naval power projection, which is one of the most important ways in which you can establish your role as a global superpower, that's what happened in the United States with the buildup of the US Navy in the late 1800s, early 1900s, that allowed us to traverse the world's oceans and really make the world safer for trade with the United States, right? To safeguard our exports to the world and imports for US consumers. That's what China ultimately wants to do, right? And China is even more dependent on exports and imports than we are. And it can't really do that without being able to project naval power. And to project naval power, particularly in this day and age, you need submarines. And the challenge with shallow waters is that if you're leaving the Chinese ports, like the port of Hainan, for example, in southern China, the waters there are so shallow that those submarines can be very easily tracked by the US. And you're going through the choke points in the so-called First Island chain that stretches from Japan through Taiwan down to the Philippines, through those choke points that are controlled by the US Navy, right? So your ability to get out into the Pacific, to project your power across the world is highly limited. You're at the mercy, essentially, of America, being able to blockade you at our whim. You can't let that happen if you think that you're going to be the world's greatest power, right? And if you take Taiwan, and if you're able to build naval bases, submarine bases on the eastern side of Taiwan, where the waters are very deep, right? In the Taiwan Strait, on the western side of Taiwan, it's about 300 feet deep, too shallow to really put submarines in without being able to easily be tracked. On the other side of Taiwan, it drops to 12,000 feet and goes down even further from there. That gives you an ability to project power, to dominate that eastern Pacific Ocean, the western Pacific Ocean, and push the US Navy out, because it would make it untenable for us to operate our naval bases in Japan. Our Marines are in Okinawa, the headquarters of the 7th Fleet on Japan as well. It would make our presence in the Philippines very dangerous, right? Push us all the way out to Guam and Hawaii, and allow China to really be the security dominant power in that region. In many ways, similar to the way that Russia is in Central Asia, for example, right? We're recording this podcast on the day that Putin is visiting Mongolia. And there's all this consternation that Mongolia is a member of their National Criminal Court that has issued an arrest warrant for Putin, and the Mongolian president is not only not arresting Putin when he's showing up in the country, but he's rolling out the red carpet for him. And the reason is that Mongolia has no choice, right? It is sandwiched between China and Russia. Its security is completely dependent on these great powers, and the same is true for other states in Central Asia, states in the Caucasus as well. And it's not that those states are in constant fear that Russia or China are about to invade them, but they have to think about that, right? And when those big powers say jump, they usually say how high, because you have no other choice, right? America's far away, not going to do anything for you. So do you really want to see that happen to East Asia, Japan, Philippines, South Korea? Asia, of course, is a region where you have almost 50% of the world's GDP, most of the supply chains, most of the economic growth. And allowing China to dominate that region from a security perspective and ultimately set the rules of trade and order in that region would be incredibly detrimental to the United States, would enable China's rise, and would diminish American power, and ultimately, I believe, would be used as a jumping off point, as a springboard for China to establish even broader dominance than they already have across the world. It's not, I want to make clear, it's not that I believe that China is going to be on some sort of Hitlerian march across the globe, and after Taiwan it's going to invade Japan or Philippines or whatever. I don't think so. I think, invading Japan would have been really difficult for the United States in 1945. It is next to impossible now for anyone, China or not. But you don't have to invade countries to dominate them, to set the rules of the security order, and that's what I think will happen. And it will be the end of, I think, American century, American superpower, and ultimately is going to have an effect not just on our national security, but our economic security.
I want to push back on that a little bit, just because if we look at, excuse me, the defense posture for the United States and the region, you have South Korea, Australia, Japan, Indonesia, Philippines, a litany of countries that you just went through and we're discussing that are clearly not inclined, both historically and contemporary, to be a hegemonic subject of China. And we seem to be basing so much of our time and energy when it comes to looking at China on Taiwan. So two parts of this. Are we looking at the relationship with China too much through the lens of Taiwan? One. And two, do we need to start thinking about things in potentially a different era? I mean, if we're talking about the naval aspect, the most recent NDAA only had one Virginia-class submarine in it. That is not sending a signal to China, which now has the world's largest Navy. So it seems like we are trying to push a level of American power that is not necessarily commensurate with the regional dynamics and our own interests.
Yeah. Well, the defense industrial base conversation is a totally separate conversation that we should absolutely have.
We're getting to that next.
Right. We are in terrible shape. The reason why we can't buy more Virginia-class subs is not because we can't allocate money, it's because we don't have the shipyards to do them. And that's part of the magic of AUKUS, is being able to bring on additional capacity to actually produce these submarines, right? So beyond the money, you need the workers, you need the shipyards to actually build them. But look, just imagine the scenario. We wake up tomorrow and China has Taiwan. Forget how, whether we fight for it, whether we don't, whatever happens, they're now in control. Imagine what happens in Tokyo, in Manila, in Seoul, where you have China now establishing bases, naval bases, sonar installations, radar installations, air bases in Taiwan. Imagine China that is now unconstrained by US power. Imagine the United States in response to the dangers that the Chinese Navy is now presenting to our logistics and our supplies in Japan and the Philippines and Korea, by the way, starting to reduce our footprint in those regions, which will happen because this is exactly what happened in the South China Sea, right? We ignored for 2 decades as China was building these artificial islands in South China Sea, that it militarized, put bases on them, radar installations, and so forth. And today, South China Sea has essentially become a lake for the Chinese Navy, which makes it very, very dangerous for the US Navy to operate. Yes, we do an occasional freedom of navigation exercise where we go by one of these islands, but if you talk to anyone in the Navy, anyone in the Indo-Pacific Command in Hawaii, should the hostilities break out with China, we're getting the heck out of South China Sea because our presence there is not sustainable and we don't see our shipping get completely destroyed by the Chinese, right? So that is going to happen in East China Sea if China dominates Taiwan, right? So just based on prudent military strategy alone, you don't want to see your shipping being interdicted, your logistics being interdicted. You will want to pull them back to a place where they're more secure, certainly in Hawaii, maybe in Guam, but very far away from the region. And how do you think the Japanese, the Filipinos, the Koreans, South Koreans are going to respond to that, right? It's not that they're going to jump all in bed with China. They certainly don't want to do that. But I've had conversations with senior officials in that region that basically told me that if this scenario plays out, if China owns Taiwan, we're going to figure out how to balance our relationship with a new hegemon in our region. Again, we're not going to disarm, we're not going to ban on our mutual defense treaty with the United States, but we now know that they're the big gorilla, and we need to accommodate them to a certain extent. Yes, invest more in our defense as well, but on a lot of issues, we're just going to have to accommodate the Chinese view, even more than they're doing today, right? Because they're already, of course, having a lot of influence just because of their economic power. Add to that military power, and that becomes a very potent combination for the Chinese.
Your book at its core is very optimistic, surprisingly, especially amongst the conversation about books on China. But the problem is there seems to be a delta between the optimism here and the practicalities of American policy. You mentioned the defense industrial base. We don't have the shipyards. If we look at critical minerals and rare earth elements, it takes 29 years to permit and establish a new mine in the United States. These seem to be, you've been talking about the threat from China. Others have been talking about the threat from China. There seems to be finally a consensus at the political level and a strategic level that China is their strategic competitor. But there doesn't seem to be the impetus for actual action at a substantive policy level. So with that in mind, has China already won?
No, I don't think they won. And look, I have 2 chapters in the book. One of them is entitled "We're Much Stronger Than We Think We Are," and they're much weaker than we think they are. And China certainly has numerous weaknesses, right, from the economics, military, et cetera. But you just said something that I think is really important. You said there's a consensus that China is a strategic competitor. I disagree with that fundamentally. I don't think China is a strategic competitor. I think they're a strategic adversary. And until we have a consensus on that this is not a competition, this is a conflict. And I argue that this is a second Cold War, Cold War II, with China. Until you have that framework that we all agree on, which to this day we don't, right? The Biden administration specifically says we don't want to be in a Cold War. I find that a very puzzling phrasing, because if you are in a bar and someone punches you, well, you don't want to be in a bar fight, but you either are or you surrender. And I certainly don't want to surrender to China. So you don't have many options here. And I've argued that the Chinese have been prosecuting Cold War against us for decades, that we've mostly just been waking up to in recent years, but still not fully, because we're not willing to acknowledge it, right? And the semantics matter, not just because of how do you want to define this episode historically, but because Cold War I allowed us the biggest benefit that we could have gotten from it, which is focus, right? We looked at everything that we were doing around the world, militarily, economically, diplomatically, et cetera, in every corner of the world through the lens of the Cold War. Sometimes not helpfully, right? We've overreached on a number of occasions: Vietnam, Iran, coup, and various adventures in Latin America, et cetera. But by and large, it allows us to say the Soviet Union is the primary threat, and we're going to do whatever it takes to contain the Soviet Union, right? By not taking that approach with China, we're allowing ourselves to get distracted in a lot of different areas. And it's not to say that, I don't have the view that some advocate for, let's abandon Ukraine, let's abandon everything that we're doing around the world. But I do think that we need to prioritize, and we need to ask the question of, is this significantly detrimental to our efforts to contain China? If not, absolutely, let's do it. If it is, then we have to find other ways to accomplish our national security objectives, because real world is about trade-offs, and you can't do it all, right? You don't have the power to do so. With regards to the trajectory of our policy, I do think that over the last 2 administrations, the Trump administration and now the Biden administration, the direction has roughly been a good one, right? We've realized that this is no longer about welcoming China's rise, which President Obama said in 2015, right? He said, we welcome China's rise. Well, no one in this town in Washington, D.C. welcomes China's rise anymore, right? That was a ridiculous statement to make. But the other side of the coin is, how fast are you actually moving to implement those policies? And I argue that the velocity of change is way too slow, particularly given the danger of conflict in the next potentially 4 years, right? And it's not that we are not investing in the right capabilities. We are building Virginia-class subs. We're investing in long-range strike capabilities. We're investing in programs like Replicator to give us more autonomous unmanned capabilities. They're just not moving fast enough, right? And they're not being prioritized as critically as I think they should be.
When you look about the situation now, you're saying that China is a strategic adversary. When we look at that, so much of what's in here is a defensive reactionary strategy to create more favorable conditions for deterrence and systemic resilience for the United States. If China is fundamentally a strategic adversary, shouldn't we be looking, as we did during the Cold War, to more potentially offensive actions? Obviously not direct kinetic actions against China, but being more creative in terms of engaging. China hacks us, we hack them. Information conflict. The panoply of tools available to the United States doesn't necessarily seem to be being leveraged. And granted, we don't know everything that's going on behind the scenes, but if there's a sense of urgency here, you would want to be putting your best foot forward and reacting, in that bar fight, not just taking the punch.
Well, I do argue that we should take some offensive measures, and you could argue whether they're offensive or defensive. For example, China has been waging economic warfare against us for the better part of 2.5 decades. right? Stealing our intellectual property, stealing trade secrets through both cyber means and otherwise. And I argue that we should retaliate against Chinese companies that are doing this with sanctions, with tariffs, try to effectively destroy those businesses that we can tie directly to benefits from IP theft. So I don't know if you count it as defensive or offensive, but we should certainly be doing that. I'm not in favor of what some have suggested, which is let's go after the CCP, right? I think that is dangerous. I think the last thing you want is for the CCP to think that they're in a truly existential conflict with us, right? What I want them to realize is that the costs of taking Taiwan are too high, and particularly too high from the perspective of surviving in power for Xi Jinping personally and for the Chinese Communist Party in the broader sense. And it's not worth it, right? And let's just wait and push this issue back to future generations as we have done since 1949. That would be the ideal scenario for me. Going after the CCP, through information operations or anything else that you want, I think makes them think that this is an existential struggle and that everything should be on the table. And two, I just don't think it can work because our track record of this and track record of regime change, frankly, of the last 2 decades or even longer is not a good one. So I don't want to go there. And again, I fundamentally believe that we are stronger than them. We have an economy that is they're 25% smaller in terms of GDP than us, right? We have a military that is much stronger. We have an alliance network that is eclipses anything that China has. We have geography that is unbelievably advantageous, surrounded by 2 oceans, right? No natural enemies on our border, where China has a border conflict with almost every single country on its periphery. We have the power of innovation in our economy, the power of ideas in terms of being able to have elections every 4 or 2 years in Congress and get new policies implemented when the old ones don't work, right? We have all those advantages. And on top of it all, we have the advantage of immigration because the Chinese population, as you know well, is undergoing a demographics collapse, right? They're losing about 1 million people a year already, and that's going to accelerate as the century progresses. They have about 1.4 billion people today. By the end of the century, they're likely to have about 550 million, right? A demographic collapse unlike any we've ever seen in history. Now, 550 million is still a lot of people, still bigger than population in the United States today, but it is going to have an enormous deflationary impact on their economy and ultimately is going to make them a much less potent economic and military power. So I argue that just like with the Cold War, one, if we contain them, if we prevent them from achieving hegemony status in East Asia by taking Taiwan, and taking aggressive actions to contain their economic coercion against other states and economic warfare that they're engaging against us, we can play the long game and win without risking a conflict, which would be disastrous for us, disastrous for the world.
You talked about the demographic collapse, the political challenges China's having. Hal Brand's book, Danger Zone, is very much about that. But there seems to be a risk that we almost are looking for things that we want to see. And some China experts are saying that China under Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party is a lot more adaptable and responsive to internal pressures than perhaps the United States thinks it is. Is that something you believe in or subscribe to, or are these challenges so significant that it doesn't matter really what the party does?
Well, I think 2 things. They are incredibly significant. When I talk to economists about what China needs to do to solve its enormous economic challenges, right? Demographics is only one of them, and it's not even being reflected in the economic data yet. It will probably be reflected in the next decade or so. But the economic stagnation, right? The growth rates coming down massively, no longer double digits as we've seen over the last 40 years. The real estate bubble that is much, much bigger than ours was in 2008, right? At the height of 2008, real estate was about 10% of our GDP. It is 30% in China. Just absolutely enormous. And by the way, most of the Chinese savings are in real estate. They don't trust the stock market. The stock market has been stagnant for the last 15 years. You've had this enormous growth in the Chinese economy, no reflection of asset prices in the stock market going up, right? The banking sector is in terrible shape, corruption throughout the economy. And I ask people, what would you do if you were in charge, if you were Xi Jinping for a day or a year, and they're saying, this is so difficult, like, I don't even know where to start. And there are some ideas people have, but Xi Jinping is not doing any of those ideas, right? It is difficult to begin with, even if you're the smartest economist in the world. And Xi Jinping is basically saying, no, I'm not going to do stimulus. I'm not going to deal with the real estate issues to any certain significant extent. I'm not going to try to incentivize consumption in the economy to try to balance out the exports that are increasingly facing hostility, not just from the United States and Europe, but from lots of countries around the world, right? There's a lot of talk about EVs and how China is going to be dominating the EV sector in the coming years. And it's not only the United States and Europe that have just announced tariffs on EVs, but countries like Brazil, Turkey, India, right? A lot of countries with big populations, big markets, potentially for China, that will make it much more difficult for them to export those goods to. So they're facing a really problematic situation in the global economy, being able to consume a lot of their overcapacity, and they don't want to develop their own domestic consumption market, right? On top of this being an incredibly big challenge for anyone, Xi Jinping is doing everything possible to make it much worse. So I don't agree with the view that they're going to figure it out, because maybe under Deng Xiaoping they could have, but not under this guy.
I want to go political for a second. I mean, who does China fear more? Is it a Trump presidency or is it a Harris presidency?
I don't think that they actually have a huge preference, to be honest with you. Nor do I think that Putin does either. I think that both, by the way, believe that the trajectory of US-China or US-Russia relationship is set. They believe in the sort of deep state conspiracy theory that no matter who's president, the direction of US policy is only going to go one way. And on China, by the way, it's obvious, because both Harris and Trump have basically taken a position that's fairly hostile to China. There are positives and negatives with both. I think with Harris, they can count on a much more restrictive stance in terms of aggression, so more cautious approach. Let's get all the allies on board before we take any action. Much slower response, where Trump can come in and do a 60% tariff across the board, allies be damned, and so forth. But on the other hand, he may aggravate allies and destroy some of the cohesion that the Biden administration has enhanced in the Indo-Pacific. So there are positives and negatives for them. I think on balance, I'm not sure that they would have a preference one or the other.
You mentioned trade-offs earlier in the discussion, and it brings to mind some of the conversation that's happening, particularly within the Republican Party, about the balance between supporting Ukraine and Europe and Taiwan and Indo-Pacific. I mean, folks like Elbridge Colby, the Strategy of Denial, his whole book is very much focused on that for the Indo-Pacific. Where do you stand on this sort of Asia first, Ukraine priority, and how do we balance this? Or is the balance artificial and false? Can we do both?
So I think there's nuance here that often gets lost in this debate. I don't think the choice is let's abandon Ukraine and let's only do China, or let's only do Ukraine and not do the Indo-Pacific. I do believe in the primacy of the Indo-Pacific region. Taiwan matters a lot more to us than Ukraine. Doesn't mean that Ukraine doesn't matter, but Taiwan matters more. It also doesn't mean let's not give anything to Ukraine. I think there's lots of capabilities that we've given to Ukraine. Most of them are totally fine and are not impacting our capabilities in the Indo-Pacific. Most of the land warfare stuff we've given them, whether it's armored vehicles, tanks, small arms, artillery systems, most of that is not going to be very useful in the Indo-Pacific. Where I have heartburn is primarily in the air defense space. And it's really difficult because air defense is what Ukraine arguably needs the most right now, right, as they're getting pummeled by Russian missiles on a daily basis and drones. And the reality is our interceptors are very limited, and our stockpile of those. We have just, by the way, exhausted a huge number of them in the Red Sea in the last 6 months with literally no effect, as we were trying to shoot down all these Houthi drones and missiles, and at an enormous cost that is very difficult for us to replenish. So I think we have to be looking at the constraints of our air defense and not saying to Ukraine, we're not going to do anything, but really pushing on the Europeans. And they have some great systems, the NASM system that the Norwegians have developed, the IRST system that the Germans have. You've got to really ramp up on the production of the interceptors here and allow us to focus our efforts on the Indo-Pacific and the air defense space. So that's probably the biggest area where I think you could make a very strong case that our assistance to Ukraine, as critical as it is for the Ukrainians, for their population, for their economy, is being very, very detrimental in the Indo-Pacific region. And China, we have to be cognizant of, has the world's largest rocket and missile arsenal. So on most everything else, I think it's great that we're helping Ukraine and providing support. On air defense, we've got to be much more thoughtful.
I want to stick with Ukraine for a second. I know we're coming up close, unfortunately, to the time here. I mean, what does winning in Ukraine look like for you? Because you're right, our ambiguity, good Lord, our ambiguity means that our definition of victory in this conflict is essentially being left to Ukraine, which itself has issued contradictory statements on its ultimate desired outcome. That's not a successful recipe for a winning grand strategy. What do you think is the art of the possible when it comes to Ukraine?
Well, so the debate about the ending of this war, I think, has been quite misguided, because most of the discussion has been around territory. Can Ukraine get back the 2022 border to the 2022 borders that existed before Putin launched his full-scale invasion? Or can they get back to the 2014 borders, the original borders of Ukraine that are internationally recognized? First of all, I think the 2022 borders are just a complete distraction, because under no circumstances do I see, however this war ends, that we're going to be at 2022 borders, right? Because you can imagine a scenario where Ukraine gets back to some semblance of those borders, which means that it is defeating Russia, it is taking back territory, and what they're artificially going to stop at some random village where the borders existed some years back. There's just no circumstance in which it would happen. So they're either going to keep going or they're never going to get there, but those 2022 borders I just don't think are even an option. But the bigger issue here with this war is that, ironically, for both sides, for Ukraine and Russia, territory is only a secondary consideration. Ultimately, when you think about Putin, what he really wants is control of Ukraine, or massive influence if he can have full outright control, right? And him taking these villages across the Donbass is actually not getting him any closer to achieving that goal. In fact, arguably is making it much more difficult, right? Because he's not getting any closer to Kiev, and no one in Kiev is getting any more interested in any sort of accommodation with him, political accommodation, because he's having this success at enormous cost of lives and Russian resources. For Ukraine, while territory matters a great deal, and even more than just the land itself, the people that are left in those occupied territories that are facing unspeakable horrors, children being kidnapped, tortures, rapes, etc., they want to get those people liberated, obviously, and brought back to their country. And they want to have their country back to their rightful, internationally recognized 2014 boundaries. But when you talk to the Ukrainians in Kiev, as I have, and others, you get the very distinct feeling that what they really, really want, more than anything else, having suffered years of this conflict, not just since 2022, but since 2014, right? This war has been going on for 10 plus years now. They want durable security. That however this war ends, they want to make sure that Russia never does this again, right? That all the sacrifices that they've suffered, all the deaths and destruction, that it's going to be worth something, right? And it would be wonderful to take back all the territory, but that is the most important issue for them, which in practical terms really means NATO membership, right? And the Article 5 security guarantees that they would like. And ironically, taking more territory back from Russia in the Donbass or Zaporizhia, etc., does not actually get them any closer to that goal either. Because you can imagine a scenario where Ukraine takes back every inch of its territory, back to the 2014 boundaries, and the war wouldn't end, right? Putin would just say, well, I'll keep lobbing missiles and drones at Ukraine and keep terrorizing them and destroying their power grid and making them suffer. And why would he concede the thing that matters most to him, which is NATO membership for Ukraine? And by the way, NATO membership, I think, is really important to him, not purely from a defensive perspective, as some make the argument that he's afraid that NATO would invade from Ukraine into Russia, although I do think that is a consideration for him that can be dismissed. But more importantly, if Ukraine is a part of NATO, that removes his optionality to invade the country again and to try to influence and control it, right? So from that point alone, he does not want Ukraine to be into NATO because, remember, his goal is ultimately influence in the country. So, the irony here is that both sides are fighting over territory, and whether they take territory or lose it is not actually contributing to their ultimate goals for Putin control of the country, for Ukraine getting into NATO. And it's difficult to see how this conflict ends in a full resolution, right? And in fact, most wars don't end in a clean resolution that leaves everyone happy, right? There are only a few since 1945 where you've had, an outright loss of a country and, the Missouri surrender documents being signed. Most of them end in unsatisfactory fashion with some sort of frozen lines that everyone's unhappy with, that can always resume at a future date. And unfortunately, I think that is what's likely to happen here.
And I think, unfortunately, we're running out of time, and that may have been the point at which we end for this conversation. And I think the hallmark of a very good conversation is one that can keep going well beyond the allotted time. So we're going to have to schedule a second conversation if I can be so selfish with your time.
Absolutely.
With that, that's going to bring our episode to a close. I want to thank Dmitri Alperovitch for joining us today. Thank you, as always, to Colleen Wolfe, Claude Jennings, the entire NSI staff for helping produce today's episode. Coffee and Conflict is available on Spotify and other fine purveyors of podcasts. This episode will also be on YouTube and NSI's webpage. Make sure to join us for our next episode in just 2 short weeks, where I welcome Major General Mick Ryan, who'll be discussing his book, The War for Ukraine, Strategy and Adaptation Under Fire. As always, if you like what you've heard or saw, be sure to rate, review, and subscribe. Dmitri, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. And if I can add one more thing, I end the book with a Latin phrase that I think is really important. It's a nod to Cato the Elder, who, of course, 2,100 years ago would close every speech in the Roman Senate with the phrase Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed. I end the book with a phrase Sine deterrente sunt, China must be deterred.